Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming back to the Love and Betrayal channel. Today, I have a new and quite interesting story to share with you, The Perfect Plan. I never believed in love at first sight, but hate, that was instantaneous. The moment I saw Ethan Blackwood standing in that hotel lobby, his confident smirk, his arrogant posture, the way people stepped aside for him like he owned the ground, they were walking on. I knew I had found my target. He didn't recognize me, of course he didn't. To him, I was just another nameless face in the crowd, but to me, he was the man responsible for the destruction of my family. 15 years ago, my father's company went bankrupt. Overnight, we lost everything, our home, our dignity, and eventually, my father himself. He shot himself in the study. My mother said it was the shame, but I knew better. It was because of Ethan Blackwood's father, Raymond Blackwood, who orchestrated the downfall of my father's business to monopolize the entire construction sector. And now, years later, with Raymond dead, his legacy lived on through Ethan. Ethan had inherited the throne, the empire, the blood money, and I was going to take it all away from him. Not through violence, not through threats, but through something much more dangerous, love. I reinvented myself. From Amelia Hart, the daughter of a disgraced man, to Amelia Lane, polished, confident, mysterious. I studied Ethan's life obsessively, his routines, his relationships, his habits. He was a creature of pattern. Same gym at 6 a.m., same coffee order, Americano, 2 sugars, same cold expression in every photo. Men like him didn't believe in chaos, but that was exactly what I intended to bring. The first step was the accidental meeting. I arranged it perfectly. I bumped into him at a charity gala, one I made sure to be invited to through a series of carefully constructed connections. I wore red, not for attention, for power. When he turned around, his eyes scanned me with curiosity. "Are you all right?" he asked, catching my arm as if I might fall. I smiled, just the right amount of flustered. "I'm so sorry, but I wasn't looking." He chuckled. Neither was I. The contact lasted longer than necessary. Hook, line, sinker. From there, things moved quickly. He called the next day, invited me to lunch by the third. By the second week, I was the woman who laughed at his dry jokes, who leaned just close enough to keep him wanting more. And when he finally kissed me under the city lights, I didn't feel butterflies. I felt victory. This was working. The plan was simple: make him fall in love, marry him, gain access to the Blackwood assets, take it all, leave him broken. A perfect plan, one that would finally give my family justice. But there was one thing I hadn't accounted for. He wasn't the monster I expected. Ethan was guarded, yes, yeah, cold even, but underneath that icy exterior was a man who carried pain in silence. He never talked about his father unless forced. And when I brought up the past, carefully, like a surgeon testing a wound, his jaw would tighten. "People think success makes up for everything," he once told me, "but some things, they leave marks that never fade." I wanted to scream, "You mean like driving a man to suicide?" But I smiled instead and touched his hand. I reminded myself, this is not love, this is war. A month later, he prepared, month later, he proposed. It was in Yertz over a quiet dinner in a rooftop garden. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt nervous. "Amelia," he said, pulling out a velvet box, "I don't believe in fate, but I believe in you. Marry me." I said yes. Of course I did. But that night, lying beside him in a suite that overlooked the Seine, I couldn't sleep. His arm was draped over me, warm, trusting. I stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of person I'd become. Was I still the girl seeking justice, or had I become something worse? Still, I pushed forward. The wedding was a spectacle, lavish, elegant, watched by the media and the vultures that fed off power and wealth. I wore white. Ironic, really. Behind the smile, I knew what I was about to do. I had gained access to his home, his accounts, his trust. Soon I would find what I needed: documents, transactions, dirty secrets, whatever would destroy the Blackwood name. But there was one problem. Every time he looked at me like I was the only person in the room, every time he reached for my hand in silence, every time he whispered, "I'm lucky to have you," when he thought I was asleep, a part of me cracked. Cracked. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to care. But maybe revenge isn't as clean as I thought. Maybe hate is not the opposite of love. Maybe they're just two sides of the same coin, spinning wildly between destruction and something terrifyingly real. They say a wedding is the happiest day of your life. Mine felt like a countdown to detonation. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers and floral arrangements flown in from Italy. Strings of violins filled the air while 100 pairs of eyes watched us. The perfect couple, the perfect love story. Cameras flashed, champagne glasses clinked, and somewhere between the speeches and the vows, I felt like I was drowning in a life that wasn't mine. Ethan looked like a dream in his tailored tuxedo. I looked like every bit the fairy tale bride. But underneath my custom made gown was a storm of doubt and guilt. This was supposed to be the final phase of the plan: marry him, secure access, and then tear it all down from the inside. And yet, as I stood there saying I do to the man I once swore to ruin, my voice trembled, not from nerves, but from something far more dangerous: emotion. Our honeymoon was in a private villa tucked in the Amalfi Coast, secluded, romantic, a place where time slowed down. It should have been the perfect opportunity to investigate. I had already memorized the layout of his office back home. I knew his safe's combination. I knew where he kept his files, the laptop he never let anyone touch. But in Italy, he left all of that behind. Here it was just us. He woke me with coffee in bed. He kissed my forehead before every meal. He whispered things no one had ever said to me before. "Promise me something," he said one evening as we sat by the water, barefoot, the moonlight dancing over the waves. "What? Don't ever lie to me." My throat tightened. I smiled instead. "I promise." And just like that, the first real crack split through the foundation of my plan. Back home, am, reality returned. I resumed the mission. At night, when he was asleep, I'd slip out of bed and head to his office. I knew the passcode, his mother's birthday. Inside, I found financial records, board meeting minutes, and encrypted files about old acquisitions, and then I found a locked drawer. Inside it was a folder labeled Blackwood Holdings, 2008, the year my father died. My hands trembled as I flipped through it. There it was, proof that Raymond Blackwood had orchestrated a fraudulent, hostile takeover of my father's company. But next to the contract was a letter written by Ethan. "Father, I cannot sign off on this. This is unethical, and if you force this through, I will leave this company forever. I want no part in destroying a man's life for your empire, Ethan." I blinked. I read it again and again. It wasn't what I expected. He had fought it. He wasn't the villain I thought he was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ethan rolled over, wrapping an arm around me. "You're tense," he murmured. "I'm just overwhelmed," I whispered. He kissed the back of my neck. "I get it. Being a Blackwood wife isn't easy, but I'm here. I'll protect you, always." I wanted to cry, because how do you destroy a man who once tried to stop the very thing that ruined your life? How do you keep lying to someone who holds you like you matter? The days turned into weeks. Every dinner party, every business function, I stood by his side. I played my role perfectly, but each time he introduced me as my wife, each time he whispered, "Thank you for loving me," I felt the plan slipping further and further away. But the past doesn't loosen its grip easily. One night I got a call from her, my mother. "I saw the magazine cover," she hissed. "You married him. You actually did it." "Everything is under control," I replied. "I've found documents that can expose them. I just need more time." Her voice was sharp. "Time? Do you even remember why we started this? Your father's death, our life in ruins?" "I remember," I said quietly. But did I? Or had the lines begun to blur? Ethan never questioned me. Not when I came home late, not when I disappeared into the library for hours, not even when I stared at him sometimes like I was searching for something that wasn't there before. He simply loved me without asking for proof. One morning I found him watching me as I got dressed. "What?" I asked. He smiled. "I still can't believe you're mine." I turned away quickly, afraid he might see the war behind my eyes. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The woman who wanted revenge, or the wife who was starting to love her enemy. Then came the board meeting. Ethan asked me to join him, said he trusted my instincts. I sat beside him at the long mahogany table, while powerful men and women discussed millions like they were lunch receipts. But it was Ethan who commanded the room, calm, decisive, fair. At one point, an executive sneered, "Your father would have shut this deal down in a second." Ethan leaned back, his gaze sharp. "And that's why he's not in this chair anymore." There was silence, but I saw it, the line Ethan had drawn. He wasn't his father. He was trying to build something better. And I was still trying to tear it down. That night, I stood outside his office with the USB in my hand, the one I'd used to transfer the incriminating files to my contact. But my hands shook, my heart pounded. I could hear his voice from the bedroom, low, singing something off key. He only did that when he was happy. And suddenly the question crashed into me like a wave. What if I'm wrong? What if I destroy a man who never deserved to pay for his father's sins? What if I already have everything I ever wanted, but I'm too blinded by vengeance to see it? I closed the office door, left the USB in my pocket, and walked back into the bedroom where he waited, completely unaware of the war raging inside his wife's heart. They say hate is simple, clean, straightforward, but no one warns you what happens when that hate begins to unravel, when it slips through your fingers like sand, when the man you once swore to destroy becomes the only one who sees you for who you are, and still chooses to love you anyway. I couldn't sleep. Lately, the nights felt longer, quieter, heavier. I used to dream of the moment Ethan would fall, of how sweet it would feel to watch his world crumble. But now, when I closed my eyes, all I saw was his smile, the way he whispered, "I love you," into my hair, the way he pulled me closer even when I pushed him away. I tried to bury it, to remind myself of the truth. He's the son of the man who destroyed my family. He wears the name Blackwood like a crown. But it wasn't working anymore because now, when I looked at him, I didn't see the enemy. I saw the man who stayed up all night when I had a fever, the man who kissed my fingertips after every argument, the man who told me without words that he would never leave. One morning I found him sitting by the window, staring out into the rain. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, but he didn't move. I walked over, my robe wrapped tightly around me. "Everything okay?" He looked up, startled. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "About how fragile everything is." I frowned. "Then, what do you mean?" He picked up a framed photo from the table. It was us, taken on the honeymoon. He ran his thumb over it slowly. "I spent so many years trying to build something stronger than my father ever did, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just rebuilding on top of his ruins. And it's all going to collapse anyway." There it was again, that quiet pain he never shared with anyone else, except me. And I hated that I understood it. The next day, I visited my mother. I needed clarity. I needed to remind myself of why I started all this. She lived in a small condo now, cold, sterile, always smelled like bleach and bitterness. "You're not getting soft, are you?" she said, eyeing me over her teacup. I didn't answer. She scoffed. "You were always the emotional one. That's why I had to push you into this." "Push me?" I repeated. "Yes, you were too young to understand what they did to us, what he did." "Ethan didn't do anything," I snapped. "This, it was his father." She raised an eyebrow. "So now you're defending him?" I looked away. "He's blinded you," she continued, "and you've forgotten the blood that was spilled to keep his empire standing." I clenched my fists. And then in my fists, "I haven't forgotten, and I don't know what's right anymore." She leaned back, her voice cold. "Then you'd better remember fast, because the longer you wait, the more you risk falling too deep." Too late. I already had. That night, I found Ethan in his office, surrounded by open folders and drafts of contracts. He looked up, surprised. "Couldn't sleep either." I shook my head. "What are you working on?" "Trying to undo a deal my father made years ago. It's a mess, lots of damage, lots of people hurt." My heart skipped. "What kind of deal?" He sighed. "It doesn't matter now. I just want to make it right." And I believed him. Not because I wanted to, but because I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind of tired you don't fake. The next morning, everything changed. I received an email from a contact I hadn't spoken to in months, a journalist I had once paid to quietly dig into the Blackwood legacy. Subject: urgent. "Thought you'd want to see this. Found proof your mother might have lied about more than just the takeover." Attached were scanned court documents, hidden settlements, and one shocking letter. It was from my father. Dated dated 2 months before his death. "I regret trusting Raymond, but the bigger mistake was trusting her. She pushed me to sign, said we had no choice, but I think now she wanted the company gone, maybe for the insurance, maybe for revenge. I don't know anymore. All I know is I can't live with what I've done." My hands trembled. I dropped the phone. My mother, the woman who had fed me every lie, the one who said they ruined us, the one who convinced me to ruin someone else in return. She wasn't the victim. She was part of it. I stared out the window, heart pounding. The walls I'd built for years, walls of hate, of revenge, of pain, they began to collapse. Ethan wasn't my enemy, my own past was. The plan had always been about justice, but now? Now it felt like I was just a puppet in someone else's game. And the only person who had shown me real love was the one I was meant to destroy. That evening, I cooked dinner for him. Nothing fancy, just pasta, his favorite wine, and silence between us that didn't feel heavy. He raised a glass. I hesitated, but then I clinked my glass against his. To second chances, I whispered. He smiled. You believe in those? I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I let myself feel everything I had tried to suppress. I think I'm starting to. There was a door in the east wing of the house Ethan never opened. It wasn't locked, but it was sacred, off limits, unexplained. The only space in our home that felt like it didn't belong to us. I had passed it 100 times, always in silence, always pretending I didn't notice the way his eyes avoided it, or the subtle tension that entered his shoulders whenever I lingered too long in that hallway. But now, after everything I'd discovered, the lies from my mother, the truth about my father, the way Ethan had fought his family's darkness, I couldn't ignore that room any longer. Because if I truly wanted to know the man I married, not as a target, not as a plan, but as a person, I needed to see what was behind that door. One evening, he came home later than usual. He looked exhausted, loosened tie, shadows under his eyes. I have a headache, he murmured. I'll shower and go to bed early. I kissed his cheek. I'll stay up and read a bit. He nodded. Then he nodded, too tired to notice the shift in my voice. As soon as he disappeared into the bathroom, I moved quickly, barefoot, heart pounding. I walked to the east wing, past the dusty frames, the quiet, untouched hallway that no staff ever entered. The door was old, white, slightly worn around the knob. I turned it. It creaked open slowly, and what I saw made my breath catch. It was a memorial. Not a room, a shrine. Soft yellow walls, a velvet armchair in the corner, and shelves upon shelves of books, notebooks, photo albums. A dusty record player sat by the window, and above it, a painting of a woman. Young, delicate, dark hair, kind eyes. She was smiling in a way that made my stomach twist. Because it was a real smile, a loved smile. Underneath, in gold script, was a name. Isabella. I froze. Who was she? I opened one of the albums on the desk. Dozens of photos of Ethan with her, laughing in cafes, holding hands on beaches, dancing in the rain. They looked happy, free, like a life lived before the weight of legacy and betrayal. Then I saw it, a photo of her wearing a ring, his ring. She wasn't just someone he loved, she was someone he married. My mind spun. He had never mentioned her, not once, and yet here was an entire world he'd kept hidden. I opened a small drawer in the desk and found her journal. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. Ethan wants to protect me. He always does. But I wish he knew it's not cancer that scares me. It's the thought of him being alone after I'm gone. The page is blurred. She had died. And this room was the only place where she still existed. Suddenly I heard footsteps. I turned around sharply, and there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway, motionless, wet hair, barefoot, eyes fixed on mine. You weren't supposed to be in here, he said, voice low. I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't mean to. He walked in slowly, his gaze not angry, just tired. It's okay, he said. You would have found it eventually. He sat down in the chair, staring at the portrait. She was my wife, he said after a long pause. Her name was Isabella. We were married for 3 years. She got sick, and I couldn't save her. The silence that followed was deafening. I never talked about her, he continued, because I didn't want anyone to pity me, and because I didn't think I'd ever love again. My heart twisted. He looked at me finally. Then I met you. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond when you realize you're standing in the shadow of a ghost? Later that night, we lay in bed. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what I saw hung between us, but something had changed. Because now I knew what it meant every time Ethan looked at me like he was grateful, not just for love, but for life. He had already lost once, and he loved anyway. He had every reason to shut down, to lock that room forever. But instead, he kept it open, kept her memory alive, not out of guilt, but out of love that didn't have to end just because she did. The next morning, I placed a single white rose in the memorial room. No words, just a gesture. Ethan saw it later that evening. He didn't say anything. He just took my hand and held it for a long time. And I realized something terrifying. I had come here to destroy a man I believed was cold, ruthless, incapable of real emotion. But the truth was, he was the only man I had ever met who knew how to love with every broken piece of himself, and I was no longer sure if I could go through with the plan anymore. Not now, not after knowing what was behind that door. The truth doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single sentence, a folded letter, a voicemail you almost didn't listen to. Mine came in the form of a name, Isabella Hart. I was going through some of the records Ethan had left out on the dining table. He was preparing for a meeting and had asked me to sort through files for an old estate deal. Most of the documents were mundane: financials, land records, permits. But then I saw it, a letter tucked between pages, stamped with a lawyer's seal, dated 2009, the year my father died. It was a letter of petition from Isabella Hart requesting the court to investigate potential coercion in the Hart family's sale of property to Blackwood Holdings. I froze. Isabella Hart. My heart raced. I flipped to the last page. Signature, Isabella L. Hart. She wasn't just Ethan's late wife. She was also my cousin. I ran to my room and tore open an old shoebox of family photos I had hidden in the closet, images I kept not for memories but for motivation. One picture slipped out. A family reunion. I must have been 10. And next to me, smiling, was a girl about 17, dark hair, soft eyes. Isabella. The same Isabella whose face now hung on Ethan's memorial wall. I never recognized her. Back then, I barely knew her. She lived far away, and after the scandal, her side of the family disappeared from our lives. Or maybe they were erased. I called my mother. The moment she picked up, I didn't hesitate. Did you know Isabella was married to Ethan Blackwood? Silence. You knew, I said. Didn't you? Her voice came back cold. It doesn't matter now. Doesn't matter, I nearly shouted. You told me the Blackwoods destroyed our family, that Isabella was irrelevant, that she abandoned us. She did abandon us, my mother snapped. She chose him. She knew what their family did, and she still married him. I told her to testify to help us sue, but she wouldn't. Because she didn't believe your version of the story, I said slowly, because maybe you lied. You don't know what it was like, she shouted, watching your husband lose everything, watching your child grow up with nothing. Do you know what desperation does to a woman? Yes, I said softly. It turns her into the person I became. I hung up. Everything I had believed, every motive that brought me to Ethan was shaken beneath me. I had come here with a plan, but maybe I was just continuing someone else's revenge. A lie I had been fed like medicine. And worst of all, I wasn't just hurting Ethan. I was betraying Isabella, a woman who once tried to fight for our family's truth, who had loved Ethan not despite who he was, but because of who he wasn't. That night, I couldn't look him in the eye. He noticed. We sat across from each other during dinner, the silence between us louder than any argument. You okay? He asked gently. I nodded, lied, just tired, but he wasn't convinced. I know that look, he said. You're spiraling. I looked up sharply. And what look is that? The one you get when you're about to run from something instead of facing it. I blinked. I used to see it in Isabella, he said quietly. She thought hiding pain meant protecting people, but it only made her lonelier. He reached for my hand. I don't want that for us. Us. That word used to feel like manipulation. Now it felt like an anchor I didn't know I needed. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the halls, back to the East Wing, back to her room. But this time, I sat down in front of her portrait, and I whispered, I think I understand you now. I traced the edge of the frame. I used to think loving Ethan meant betraying you. Now I realize maybe you were the only one who ever saw him clearly. The next day, I went back to the estate lawyer listed in Isabella's old letter. I posed as a relative needing clarity. He didn't recognize me, but he remembered her. She was determined, he told me, and fierce, said she didn't want her family remembered as victims of Blackwood greed. I nodded. Did she ever file a case? He shook his head. She dropped it, said she didn't want to drag Ethan through more press after her diagnosis. Diagnosis? I asked, though I already knew. He looked sad. Terminal cancer, but she never stopped protecting him, even from ghosts. As I stepped outside, the wind felt different. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a weapon. I felt like a woman caught in the wreckage of inherited war. And I knew something else, too. If I didn't stop this, I'd become the very thing I swore to fight. Not a seeker of justice, but a thief of peace. And Ethan, he was the only person who never tried to hurt me. Even when I lied, even when I snooped, even when I disappeared emotionally. He waited. I had trusted. That evening, he brought me a gift. It was simple, a necklace, gold, delicate. Why, I asked. He shrugged. No reason, just I'm lucky. And I wanted to remind you. I looked at him, heart aching, because I was finally realizing the revenge I came here to deliver was never meant for him. And the love I tried to fake was the only real thing I'd ever felt. I didn't mean to fall in love with him. That wasn't part of the plan. Loving him meant weakness. Loving him meant forgetting. But love has a way of slipping through cracks, filling the spaces you thought were armored in stone. And before I knew it, Ethan Blackwood, the man I once called enemy, had become the only person who felt like home. It started in the smallest moments. The way he reached across the bed when he thought I was already asleep. The way he remembered I hated olives and always picked them off my plate without saying a word. The way he held me after my nightmares like he knew I was running from something, even if I hadn't told him what. He never asked questions, he never pried. But it was the silence that broke me. Because in that quiet, I heard everything I had spent my life trying to ignore. The guilt, the lies, the war I was still fighting in my head. And his love, gentle, undeserved, was the only thing that made me feel real. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, apron on, flour smudged across his cheek. "You're baking?" I asked, half laughing. He shrugged. "I Googled your favorite pastry." I blinked. "Lemon croissants?" He nodded, sheepish. "They look easier on YouTube." I walked over, kissed the flour from his cheek. And something inside me shifted. It wasn't just affection, it was longing. Longing for a life I didn't have to lie through. Longing for a version of me that could stay, love honestly, and be loved back. But I didn't deserve that. Not when every moment with him was built on betrayal. That night, as we lay in bed, he pulled me close. "I know you're not ready to tell me everything," he whispered. "And I won't push. But I need you to know I'm not going anywhere." Tears burned behind my eyes. He didn't know the truth. Not yet. He didn't know that the woman he adored had once plotted to destroy him, that every kiss, every "I love you" in the beginning, was a calculated step in a war he never signed up for. But now it wasn't a game. Now it was real. And that made it worse. The guilt became an unbearable instead. I tried to confess twice. Once during breakfast, when he handed me coffee and smiled like the world was perfect. Once at night, when we were dancing in the living room barefoot, and he kissed my forehead like it was sacred. But both times the words choked in my throat. Because how do you tell someone you love that everything they love about you was built on a lie? I avoided my mother's calls. Every time she rang, I stared at the screen until it stopped. I couldn't face her. Not after what I'd learned. Not after knowing she had lied to me, used me. "You were supposed to protect me," I thought bitterly, "not program me to avenge your mistakes." And maybe that was the worst part. That all this time, I thought I was choosing revenge. But the truth was, revenge had chosen me long before I understood what it meant. One evening, Ethan brought out a box, old photos, letters, a memory chest he wanted to share with me. "I've never opened this since Isabella passed," he said quietly, "but I want you to know all of me, even the parts that still hurt." I wanted to run, not because I feared what was inside, but because I knew I didn't deserve the trust he was offering. We sat together for hours, flipping through pages of his past. He told me stories of his childhood, of the night Isabella first told him she was sick, of the way he held her hand when she took her last breath. "She was light," he whispered, "and for a long time I thought I'd never feel warmth again." He looked at me. "But then you came." That night I cried in the shower. Not quietly, not pretty. I sobbed, for the girl I used to be, for the love I thought I'd never feel, for the man who gave me a second chance without even knowing I didn't deserve it. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would tell him everything. No more lies, no more shadows. If I wanted any chance of keeping this love, I had to risk losing it first. Because maybe that's what love really is. Not the absence of betrayal, but the courage to stand naked in the wreckage and say, "This is all of me. Will you stay anyway?" Some truths are confessed, others are exposed. I always thought I would be the one to tell him, that I would sit him down, look him in the eyes, and let the words fall like broken glass. But life doesn't always wait for courage. Sometimes it tears the mask off your face before you're ready to breathe without it. It was a Tuesday. Cloudy, quiet. Ethan had kissed me goodbye that morning like he always did, lightly, softly, like I was a promise he still believed in. I was home alone when the envelope arrived. No sender, just my name in sharp handwriting. Inside, there were photos, printouts of emails, bank transfers to the journalist I'd once hired, a full list of my old alias names, and a single note. "You can lie to him, but not to the world." My heart dropped dead. Someone knew. Worse, someone wanted him to know. I called the only person I knew capable of doing this, my mother. She didn't even flinch. "I warned you," she said coolly. "The longer you stayed, the more you'd forget what this was about." "You betrayed me," I whispered. "No," she corrected. "You betrayed me. You fell in love with him." I clenched my jaw. "He's not like his father." "And you think that changes what they did?" she snapped. "It changes everything," I said, "because it means we've spent years building hate around the wrong man." She laughed, cold, distant. "You're not the daughter I raised." No, I said, I'm not, thank God. And I hung up. That night, Ethan didn't come home on time. I waited. Dinner turned cold. The clock ticked past 9, then 10, and then I heard the door. He stepped in slowly, quietly. His face was unreadable. I stood, and then I stood. Hey, is everything? He held up the envelope. My world cracked. I got this from a friend, he said. Jam, he said flatly. Imagine my surprise. My wife, Amelia Lane, doesn't exist, but Amelia Hart does. Daughter of Gregory Hart, niece of Isabella Hart. He paused. His voice didn't shake. That made it worse. You came to destroy me. My lips parted. Ethan, I. Don't, he said. Not yet. He walked to the bar, poured a drink, then sat down, slow, controlled, like a man holding his world in pieces. Tell me everything, from the beginning, no lies. So I did. I told him about my father, the bankruptcy, the suicide, the letter I found, the plan, the lies, the rage. I told him about my mother, about the night I met him on purpose, about every step that was never supposed to turn into anything real. And then I told him about the night everything changed, the night I fell in love with him. When I finished, he sat in silence. Then he stood up and walked out. No yelling, no slamming doors, just silence, and somehow that hurt more. He didn't come home that night or the next. I called, texted, and texted, nothing. I waited in our bed alone, cold sheets beside me, and I realized this was what I deserved. Not because I'd lied, but because I had finally found something real, and I broke it with hands that only knew how to destroy. 2 days later, I found him on the rooftop of his office building, the place he always said made him feel closest to the sky. He was leaning on the railing, looking out over the city like he was trying to remember what solid ground felt like. I stepped forward, quiet. Ethan, he didn't look at me. You should have told me. I tried, I said softly, so many times. But you didn't, he said. You let me fall. You let me love you while you carried a knife behind your back. I swallowed hard. I dropped it long ago. He finally turned. His eyes were tired, broken. Then why does it still feel like I'm bleeding? I moved closer, carefully. Because I was scared, I said, scared that the one good thing I found was the one thing I didn't deserve to keep. Tears welled in my eyes. I came here to destroy you, Ethan, but I found something I never expected. You, love, and I didn't know how to stop being who I was before I met you. He stared at me for a long moment. Then finally, a crack. A whisper. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't expect you to, I said. I just want you to know. I never faked what we became. Not one moment. He looked away, then back again. Do you still love me? My voice broke. More than anything. He nodded. I need time, he said. And with that, he walked away. Not forever. But not back to me yet. He didn't come home that night, or the next, or the one after that. But the silence wasn't what broke me. It was the emptiness, the space where his toothbrush used to sit, the absence of his jacket on the hook, the quiet hum of a home that no longer felt like one. I thought losing Ethan would feel like defeat, but it felt like something else entirely, like someone had peeled my skin off and left my heart exposed to the world. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about truth. And the truth was simple. I loved him completely, irreversibly, painfully. 3 days later, I wrote him a letter. Not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter. Because some words deserve ink, some truths need to bleed. Ethan, I won't ask for forgiveness. I won't pretend I deserve your love. What I did, what I planned, it was wrong. Every part of it. But the feelings that grew between the lies, that was the only real thing I've ever known. I didn't know what love felt like until I saw you dance barefoot in the kitchen, until I heard you hum off key while brushing your teeth, until I found myself praying that the lies wouldn't end the truth we were becoming. I came here to destroy you, but you were the one who undid me. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd still fall for you. Only this time, I'd do it honestly. Amelia, I left the letter on his desk at the office. Didn't ask the receptionist for permission, didn't even wait to see if he'd be there. I just walked away, back to the house that no longer felt like mine. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the front door. My heart stilled. I sat up, holding my breath. Then footsteps. Slow, heavy. He appeared in the doorway of our bedroom, wearing the same black coat he wore the first night we met. He didn't speak, just looked at me for a long time. Finally, he said, "You wrote the truth." I nodded, barely able to hold his gaze. I didn't know how else to make you believe me. I don't know what I believe anymore, he said. I stood. I just need you to know I'm not that girl anymore. He stepped closer. No, you're not, but you were, and that still hurts. I know, I whispered, and I'll carry that. Tears welled in my eyes. I'll carry it for the rest of my life, Ethan. I'll never forget what I did to you, but I'll also never stop loving you. His jaw clenched. I don't want to hate you, he said, voice cracking. I've tried, but I can't. I look at you, and all I see is the woman who ruined me and the woman who saved me at the same time. I stepped forward, trembling. Then don't choose either version. Choose both, because both are me. He stared at me for what felt like forever. Then he dropped his bag, took one step forward, then another, and he kissed me. It wasn't soft, it wasn't sweet. It was desperate, messy, full of pain and forgiveness and the ache of two people who never stopped reaching for each other, even when everything between them broke. Later that night, we lay in bed, our fingers entwined in the dark. I don't know how we come back from this, he said. We don't, I replied. We start again from truth. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in weeks, I slept with peace in my chest. But just when I thought the worst was over, a knock came at the door. It was early morning. A man in a black suit stood outside holding a briefcase. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, he asked politely, I represent a party with interest in the Hart estate. There are matters you need to see and decisions that could change everything. I looked at Ethan. He looked back at me. Just when we thought our story had ended, the past reached for us again. The man at the door didn't look like trouble, but trouble rarely does. He handed Ethan a folder, neatly labeled, sealed with the signature neither of us recognized. Inside were documents, and with every page Ethan turned, his face grew colder, stiffer, harder. When he got to the last page, he just stopped. He didn't speak, didn't blink. He closed the folder quietly and turned to the man. We'll be in touch. The man nodded, tipped his head, and left, like he hadn't just delivered a bomb into our living room. I waited for Ethan to speak, to scream, to demand answers, but he didn't. He simply placed the folder on the table and walked to the window. I followed. Ethan, yes. And what is it? His voice was low. It's the original contract, the one your father signed with mine. My chest tightened. I thought that document was sealed. He nodded. I did. It was, until now. I stepped closer. What does it say? He turned to me, eyes unreadable. It says your father was blackmailed by my mother. The floor vanished beneath me. Your father? He nodded. Slowly, carefully. She threatened him with something personal, something he'd done years ago, said she'd ruin him if he didn't sign the merger deal. I staggered back, sinking into the couch. All this time, we blamed his father. And now, it turned out the puppet master behind the destruction of the Hart family was the woman Ethan had always believed to be innocent. My God, I whispered. You didn't know? He didn't answer right away. Then finally, no, I didn't. The room felt too small, too quiet. She's dead, I said. You can't even confront her. I don't want to confront her, he said. I want to destroy the legacy she left behind. I looked at him, terrified. What are you saying? He turned, jaw tight. I'm saying I want to give everything away, the company, the shares, the fortune built on lies, all of it. You'd walk away? I asked. He stared at me. I'd burn it all to the ground if it meant I could finally breathe. I rushed toward him. Ethan, stop. You don't have to erase your future because of her past. He looked at me like I didn't understand, but I did, because I had lived it. I had tried to destroy someone for the sins of their bloodline, and now Ethan was about to do the same to himself. I held his face gently. You're not her, just like I'm not my father. We both carry damage, but we don't have to let it define us. He shook his head. You don't get it. If I keep this company, I keep the lie alive. I become her. No, I said firmly. You become better. You become the man who faced the truth and still chose to build something honest from it. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, everything stood still. Then he stepped back, walked over to the folder, held it above the fireplace. I held my breath. But instead of letting go, he slowly lowered his hand. I can't burn it, he said. Not yet. Why? Because the world deserves to know, not just about my mother, but about what we all did to survive. Later that night, he held my hand as we sat on the floor of our bedroom, the fireplace crackling between us. I've made my choice, he said. To walk away? He shook his head. To walk forward. He looked at me, eyes softer than they'd been in days. With you, if you'll have me. My heart clenched. You still want me? He leaned in. You didn't ruin me, Amelia. You revealed me. To myself. To what matters. I kissed him. Not out of passion, but out of something deeper. Forgiveness, gratitude, hope. The next morning, Ethan held a press conference. He stood in front of cameras, in front of power, and told the truth about the past, about the corruption, about everything the Blackwood name had hidden for decades. Some gasped, some whispered, some applauded, but no one looked away. And when it was over, he came down from the podium, walked straight to me, and took my hand. No words, just us, still standing. I once came into Ethan's life with a dagger in my hand and a storm in my heart. Now I stood beside him, unarmed, unguarded, and deeply, irreversibly in love. Not the kind of love that makes your heart race or your knees weak, but the kind that softens scars, the kind that teaches you how to live again. After the press conference, the world turned upside down. Headlines exploded: Blackwood family scandal, legacy of lies, the heir who chose truth. Some investors pulled out, some accused Ethan of betrayal, but many, many more called him brave. He didn't flinch. He faced the consequences head on. And I watched him, the man who had once been my target, become a man I deeply admired. At home, we rebuilt, not with paint or marble, but with honesty. Every morning, we started with coffee in silence, the comfortable kind, the kind where nothing needs to be said because presence is enough. We talked about everything: the things I'd hidden, the things he'd buried, the grief of losing Isabella, the shame I carried over my father, the weight of our names. And little by little, love bloomed where bitterness once lived. One evening, I stood on the balcony watching the sun dip beneath the skyline. Ethan wrapped his arms around my waist from behind. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked quietly. I thought about that question often. Did I regret the lies, the pain, the broken trust? Yes and no, because without it, I wouldn't have found him, wouldn't have faced the mirror, wouldn't have stopped the cycle that poisoned both our families for years. So I turned to him and said, "I don't regret the path, only the pain we took to get here." He nodded, then reached into his pocket. My breath caught. He pulled out a ring. Not the one from before, not the one I wore when I was pretending. A new one. One, simple, honest. "For the woman I know now," he said. "Not the one you used to be, not the one you pretended to be, but the one who stayed, who chose truth when it cost her everything." Tears filled my eyes. "I already married you," I whispered. He smiled. "But this time, will you say yes as the woman who loves me, not the one who wanted to ruin me?" I nodded, heartful, voice trembling. Yes, we renewed our vows in a quiet garden. No photographers, no press, no show. Just us, and a promise to build forward, to remember but not repeat, to forgive but not forget. Because love built on truth doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. Years later, I wrote our story down. Every chapter, every twist, every moment I nearly lost him, and every moment he chose to stay. Not to publish, not to profit, but to remember that once I married a man for revenge, and found the kind of love I never believed I deserved.